Good morning. I think we will get started. It's 9:01, and we will officially start here with our first session. So as you're making your way to your seats, we welcome you again. So again, my name is Nathan Clayton. I'm Old Testament faculty here at North Park, and I'll be moderating this session in person. And also we have Max Lee, who's helping us with our online folks. So again, as you're hearing the presentations, we want to encourage you to ask questions. Let me read a couple of things on our presenter and our respondent. So our presenter here is M. Daniel Carroll R. from Wheaton College, and Danny is the Scripture Press Ministries Professor of Biblical Studies and Pedagogy at Wheaton College. He is half Guatemalan. He was raised bilingual and bicultural, and as a youth spent most summers in Guatemala. He was professor of Old Testament at a seminary in Guatemala City for 13 years before returning to the U.S. to teach at a non-denominational seminary in Denver. Danny is now in his 9th year teaching Old Testament at Wheaton. He is the author or editor of 19 books and has published both in English and Spanish. He's long been involved with Latino churches and has done extensive work on the Bible, on immigration. He's published 4 books and a number of articles on those topics, as well as speaking in churches and colleges, seminaries, and at conferences around the country. Danny and his wife Joan have been married 48 years, and they have 2 sons and 5 grandchildren. Praise God. Our respondent is my colleague here at the seminary, Sophia Magallanges-Tsang. She's professor here of Old Testament at North Park Seminary here in Chicago. She's also a proud daughter of a Mexican immigrant. Her current book projects are Comadres, Biblical Interpretation as Scriptural Accompaniment, Reading the Word Interculturally, and she's also working on a commentary in the book of Job with another Latina co-author by the name of Celeste Gonzalez Moreno. So thank you to both of you for your work here. Just to review, so Danny will take about 30 minutes to present his content to us. Sophia will then go to the podium and present her formal response, and then we'll open up for 30 to 35-minute discussion. So Danny, we welcome you. Hospitality toward the stranger, reflection on an Old Testament motif.
And can I give a reminder to speakers not speaking directly into the mic? That's for our online listeners so that we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you, Max.
Okay, muy buenos días. It's great to be here with everyone, to see some old friends. So it's special to be back here at North Park. I was here several years ago at other symposiums, so here we are again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read part of the paper and summarize other parts of it, and you'll see the fuller version when it comes out in ex auditu. Hospitality toward the stranger, reflections on an Old Testament motif. So I begin with an introduction. In a recent article, Brittany Melton proposes hospitality as what she calls an organizing principle in Old Testament theology. She's quite right that attempts to identify a single theme, one such as covenant comes to mind, as a unifying center as well, as on the other hand, the denial of any substantive continuity and congruence across the Old Testament because of its theological plurality is proven inadequate. She argues that the theme of hospitality can offer a constructive way forward. It encompasses multiple theological traditions and importantly has the added value of highlighting the ethical thrust of the Old Testament. I applaud Melton's championing theological thought wedded to praxis. Within the Old Testament, theology has always had ethical foundations and carries implications for God's people. She expounds Genesis 18 and 19 as the foundational text of her study. These chapters provide inverse examples of the ancient practice of hospitality, one offering a set of exemplary attitudes and actions toward the angelic strangers, while the other is the mirror opposite of perverse values and behaviors. Melton does not explicitly connect her exposition of Genesis 18 and 19 toward strangers to the topic of immigration, but she does cite Deuteronomy 10:17 to 19, an important text in discussions on immigration in the Old Testament, and her subsequent appeal to the term ger. Her work becomes pertinent, therefore, to the concerns of the Symposium. In what follows, I would like first to engage the use of that biblical term, and then second, extend the trajectory of Melton's argument in ways that might prove helpful for those looking for solid biblical foundations for a stance somewhat supportive of immigration and of immigrants. Clarifying some terminology. In the section entitled Terminology, Melton maintains that it is the person labeled the ger who was hosted in the Old Testament. The discussion of hospitality presupposes that the strangers in Genesis 18 and 19 and other hospitality texts are gerim. This Hebrew term has been translated in several ways: resident alien, foreigner, stranger, and I, along with many others, understand that it primarily refers to people coming into Israel from the outside. The ger is one who settles down within the community of Israel. Today, the ger would be some sort of migrant. The fact that the ger is a foreigner who, perhaps with a family, has entered to reside in Israel makes its appropriation for hospitality as presented in Genesis 18 and 19 and other passages like it problematic. Those scenes of hospitality depict brief encounters between residents and travelers, whether in more rural areas or towns. They're not narratives attending to the long-term processes of integrating outsiders. In fact, in none of them does the term ger even appear. Admittedly, it is not necessary that the ger, the term, occur for a passage to qualify as being about a foreigner living in the community, but its complete absence and distinct conceptual meaning speak against connecting the ger with those hospitality texts. The longer horizon of incorporating the foreigner into the community, in contrast to the brief invitation to a stranger into one's home, might suggest that the inadequacy of building a hospitality model for immigration depend on passages like Genesis 18 and 19. While in a technical linguistic sense, the stranger guest in those chapters and similar passages is not a ger, and hence not an actual migrant, this does not discount, however, the significance of the ethical ideals exemplified in welcoming those outsiders. In the hospitality texts, hosts provide rest, food, and protection, and these are the kinds of things that appear in other Old Testament narratives in relationship to strangers and are addressed in legislation for them. There is a surprisingly large number of Old Testament texts that deal with migration and immigrants, whether in reference to the people of God or to other individuals and groups. From the migration of Abram and his family to Haran and then into Canaan and then into Egypt and back, to the wanderings of other patriarchs, to the exiles at the hands of the imperial invaders, and finally to the complicated process of return migration from Babylon, the Old Testament witnesses to the constant movement, whether voluntary or forced because of famine or war, of the people of God. There are instances when they receive outsiders and others when they are the outsiders in foreign lands. I will concentrate in this essay on the former, on those that portray outsiders who have come to live within the borders of Israel. And it is illuminating to run these narratives through a hospitality grid. I suggest a different foundational text than the Genesis text, before briefly turning to some others that are nearly not as well developed, which also illustrate welcoming the stranger. The second part of the section looks at what I consider realistic complications of interactions with foreigners. Too often appeal to the Old Testament, and I've seen this over the years, and immigration can remain at an idealistic level. But those thorny situations in the text provide a biblical lens for the more unpleasant side of migration that can provide a fuller picture of the phenomena. Hospitality was considered a virtue in the ancient world. Travelers at that time faced an assortment of dangerous situations, and without kin and thus food, shelter, and protection, they were susceptible to the harsh natural elements, inclement weather, and to potential violence, such as robbery. There were no formal lodging establishments like we have today, so travelers would have been dependent on the mercy of possible hosts along their journey. And to practice hospitality in that context would enhance the honor and reputation of the host, even as it involved a risk in taking in the outsider. While the acts of Abram's immediate hospitality to the visitors in Genesis 18 are mentioned by both Jewish and early Christian authors as exemplary, I turn to an extensive example of migration into Israel, not to an isolated, hospitable invitation for dinner. This account begins with the movement because of famine of Naomi. You probably know where I'm going, the book of Ruth. Her husband Elimelech and their 2 sons from Bethlehem of Judah into Moab, on the other side of the Dead Sea. There the sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. In other words, these Moabite women marry immigrants. After the death of Elimelech and her sons, Naomi decides to return to her hometown. Orpah opts to stay behind in Moab, but Ruth resolves to accompany her mother-in-law to Bethlehem. So in other words, the one who had married an immigrant, now as a widow, becomes an immigrant. Ruth's declaration to Naomi in 1:16 and 17 is rightly praised as an inspiring expression of loyalty. Her work in the fields of harvest so that the 2 could have food to eat, chapter 2. The obedient response to Naomi to visit Boaz at night on the threshing floor, chapter 3, and her well-earned praise by the elders and the townswomen in chapter 4 are stuff of countless sermons and Bible studies. While these can highlight the role of Yahweh's chesed and Ruth's selflessness, what should be not missed is that this is fundamentally a migration story. The book focused primarily on the postures and decisions of 2 individuals, Ruth, the foreigner, and Boaz in the host culture. Said another way, the story is both about Israel receiving a stranger and that stranger's incorporation into an alien context, which is made much more complicated by the ethnicity of Ruth, who is a Moabite, a people with a checkered history with Israel. What happens in the narrative also is wrapped up in ancient Israelite customs and laws, the gleaning laws, issues of land, inheritance, and childbearing, the significance of the elders and the role of patronage. And all of these impact the integration process of this foreigner, Ruth. I mentioned some of the book's poignant immigrant experience moments now. To begin with, we notice that Naomi does not respond at all to Ruth's pronouncement in chapter 1. Her words are met with silence. When the pair arrive in Bethlehem and the women come out to greet Naomi, Naomi bitterly laments her utter misfortune. And of course, all that had happened in Moab, and now her Moabite daughter-in-law will live with her as she tries to reconstruct her life. Ruth is not introduced to the town people or even mentioned. She's ignored, perhaps shunned, as she stood apart from that emotional reunion. How awkward it must have been for that foreign woman in her first encounter in Bethlehem. In chapter 2, the men in the field don't even know her name. They identify her solely by her ethnicity and her work, the Moabite. Such a common experience for immigrants. When she is called over by Boaz, she bows down to the ground and she refers to herself as a nokriya, a label that sometimes is a pejorative term for an outsider. She doesn't refer to herself as a ger, which she was, or as a widow, 2 classes of individuals who had the right to glean. Is she trying overly hard to show respect for this very important person in these unfamiliar surroundings, the very one who must grant her the permission for her to collect some food? Chapter 3, Ruth risks her budding reputation to secure a future for herself and her mother-in-law. All could have been lost in a moment. The conversation with Boaz had gone awry, or if others had discovered her presence with him that night. The resolution of Ruth and Naomi's need would have to come via what most likely was an unfamiliar set of customs for Ruth, and that, Boaz tells Ruth, would play itself out at the gates of the town. In chapter 4, we witness one last awkward moment. And the women of Bethlehem, who earlier had ignored Ruth when she and Naomi had arrived, they praised her love and devotion to Naomi, but once again Naomi says nothing. But she does take the baby boy. Could this be a sign that Naomi finally will fully embrace her foreign daughter-in-law? Earlier, Naomi had been appreciative of Ruth's efforts on their behalf, but apparently there was some reticence still. Boaz, of course, exemplifies the hospitable ideal, and this is accomplished through contextual protocols. Boaz must execute a prior step in order to be able to serve as Naomi's Goel and Ruth's husband. There was a relative who was next in line who could have first right of refusal to assume responsibility for the two women before Boaz could offer himself. The final transaction at the gate follows Israelite cultural practice with the exchange of a sandal before the elders. And in the end, the elders and the women of Bethlehem have moved toward a hospitable stance, as is evident in their complimentary words towards Ruth. This complex cultural matrix controlled the future of the immigrant peasant woman in a foreign land. In her navigation of Israel's cultural norms, and most assuredly its language, Ruth has no power or say in anything. She has to trust her self-initiative, energy, resilience, and courage in the fields and at the threshing floor. As a woman, she also must be vigilant for potential male sexual exploitation in the field, something women have had to watch out for across the ages. Clearly, Ruth is no helpless victim of her circumstances. Reciprocity in executing expectations and duties is lived out at multiple levels. And this process required time and effort from everyone. In the end, the hospitality ideal becomes a reality for this stranger in Bethlehem. There's a lot more to explore, but the point I want to make is that the hospitality ideal sometimes can be displayed immediately and quite naturally, like Boaz. In other cases, it needs time. It must be acquired or learned behavior of the townspeople. In Bethlehem, the expressions of the hospitality ideal were the fruit of seeing over time the life of this foreigner who was doing her very best to take care of a beloved member of the community while trying to become part of that community herself. The unforeseen gift to the community will be that from Obed, the son born to Ruth and Boaz, would come David, the greatest king of Israel. Not only then is Ruth not a victim, at the book's close she is grouped with the great women of Israel, respected by her peers, and readers are told that she would impact the nation's future in ways that neither she nor the townspeople could ever have imagined. In sum, the book of Ruth is down to earth, a story of hospitality and immigration, portraying the reception by the host and the mechanisms of integration. This process takes time. Various actors of the process in other times and settings may not be as exemplary as in this story. But whatever the context, the ideal holds, and that's key. The Old Testament has many examples of outsiders who were incorporated into the life of the people of Israel. And let me just mention a few. The mixed multitude that departs with Israel from Egypt, Rahab, the Canaanite woman of Jericho, Ittai, one of David's loyal soldiers, and a Gittite, the prophet Zephaniah, who is the son of Cushi, and Cushi could refer to maybe his father being a Cushite, a black African. Ebed-Melech is also a Cushite in Jerusalem at the time of the Babylonian invasion, and he was likely a mercenary commander, and he is the one who will save Jeremiah from death. Each of these foreigners became part of the community of Israel. Others didn't join Israel, but they had positive engagements with Israel. I mentioned, for example, the Midianite Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, and Naaman the Syrian general. Let me quote Catherine Southwood here. Envisioning migrants as powerless, drifting, and dispossessed anonymizes them and disregards their agency, talents, and potential. In other words, exercising the ideal of hospitality should not only be about extending grace and care to others or in need or in danger. Welcoming the stranger also entails receiving skill sets of all kinds from these foreigners for the common good. See what that would be important for us today. The examples from the Old Testament exemplify the potential positive agency of immigrants, which should not be ignored or minimized. Nor should immigrants be reduced to objects of pity or lifted up elsewhere as trophies of the hospitable. So let me complicate this. The realism of the Old Testament also is evident in portrayals of negative reception. This too is needful. Again, I am not thinking of particular incidents that exemplify the opposite of hospitality. Genesis 19 covers that one really nicely. There are other examples, however, that exhibit that long-term integration into Israel could be challenging and not conducive to the well-being of the people. The incorporation of these people either does not follow the paradigm of hospitality, of welcoming the stranger, or their integration is problematic. And again, let me just list. Hagar, an Egyptian servant who leaves her homeland with Abram and Sarai, has all kinds of problems with Sarai, becomes Sarah, and in some ways she exhibits better faith than the children of Israel themselves. Moses has two wives. The first was the Midianite Zipporah, whose reaction to the call to circumcise her son is a bit hard to understand. We do know that Moses sent her back to her father and her family, but after the Exodus, Jethro brings her and her two sons to Moses. But Moses takes a second wife, a Cushite, and she is the source of tension between Moses and his siblings, Miriam and Aaron. And some connect that dissatisfaction to the fact that if she is a Cushite, she probably was black. The Gibeonites at the conquest. The Gibeonites will be allowed to live among the Israelites, but they gain this standing through subterfuge. Uriah the Hittite, and one of David's mighty men, a select cadre of soldiers of absolute loyalty to the king, and that devoted soldier is betrayed by the king and his general. Solomon's wives. One of the first acts performed by Solomon upon assuming the throne is to marry the daughter of Pharaoh, surely following the common ancient practice of sealing political and economic alliances through marriage. King Solomon also married other women from surrounding peoples who believed in other gods and were instrumental in turning his heart from Yahweh. In a blatant contradiction to building a house for Yahweh, Solomon built high places for those other gods. How different from the prayer and the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem, which envisions the foreigner coming to pray and to learn to fear Yahweh, the God of Israel. We could also mention Jezebel coming in as queen in the northern kingdom. In all these cases, the presence of the stranger is problematic, albeit in different ways and for different reasons. And this raises issues about discernment and necessary commitments to God, ethnic attitudes, personal sin, political intrigue. How to adjudicate the hospitality ideal in those circumstances? What is more, it is important to remember that Israel, and later Israel and Judah as separate kingdoms, were surrounded at their borders by other states from which often they were under threat or directly at war. This included the larger powers of Egypt to the southwest, Aram to the northeast, the Philistine and Phoenician city-states to the west, and Ammon, Moab, and Edom to the east and the south. To recount these more difficult kinds of integration with foreigners problematizes how to consistently process the hospitality ideal in the biblical text, and maybe will cause us to try to think through those things as well. We don't negate the ideal, but they do behoove us to seek discernment and wisdom about how to avoid simplistic presentations. How can we promote and nurture properly a spirit of hospitality in the real world? An amazing contribution to the hospitality ideal that solidifies its importance in the Old Testament is the fact that the law contains an amazing number and range of laws pertaining to the stranger. This is unique in the ancient world. And I would argue that the gracious treatment of the ger, the foreigner, is at the very heart of what it means to be the people of God in the law. Ancient Israel was fundamentally an agrarian society. Bad weather, drought, or pests were a constant threat. The shadow of famine loomed over these communities. Of course, there were the terrifying trials of war and their impact on our agriculture that would require years to recover a semblance of stability. And to bear these challenges, Israel would have had to turn to their extended family or to the local community. And these are the two things that foreigners did not have. They did not have land and a peasant culture, nor their extended family, so they were at the mercy of the Israelites. The laws of Israel respond to these realities. Communal hospitality was to provide help to strangers in need. The foreigner was numbered with the poor, the widow, the orphan, and together constituting what Nicholas Walterstorff has called the quartet of the vulnerable. Let me just list some of these laws and how they were sensitive to the needs. Work, allowing the stranger to rest on the Sabbath, as well as those who were native born. What we also have is issues revolving around legal cases where there was ought to be a special dispensation for the native born with other laws and penalties for the foreigner. Food scarcity, there's several laws to help them find food because they're hungry, and we see this happening actually in the book of Ruth. Another set of laws invites the foreigner into the most precious part of Israel's life, the cult. Worship is not an area of vulnerability per se, but what these practices do is to bring the outsider deeper into the very life and heart of the host culture. Another mandate that adds an existential and relational component to engaging the stranger comes in Leviticus 19. The call to love your neighbor as yourself appropriately follows a series of laws to live justly in that chapter, Leviticus 19, as is well known. And this will be cited by Jesus, of course, in the Gospels. What perhaps is less known is the expectation of loving the foreigner or beyond the neighbor. The call to love the foreigner expands the call to love the neighbor, and now the foreign neighbor now is akin to a native-born neighbor. The question that would be pressed by the native-born inevitably would have been, well, why love the stranger? Why the mandate to be so hospitable to foreigners? Old Testament law offers at least two reasons for graciously welcoming them. The first is the historical memory of being in Egypt for centuries as slaves. And those memories of Egypt were crucial. Israel was not to treat its foreigners like Egypt had treated them. This was to be a very different kind of social polity, a supportive context for the quartet of the vulnerable. The second motivation was grounded in the very person of God. Yahweh loves the foreigner, it says in Deuteronomy 10. This love was tangible, giving them food and clothing, the passage says. I'm moving rather quickly here. One final element to consider in these reflections on hospitality is the means of inculcating and nurturing that hospitality ideal in the hearts of the people of Israel. One thing is the law, another thing is the heart. Thus far, we have looked briefly at narratives of the reception of the stranger, both positive and negative, that portray hospitality in action and legislation that mandates concrete communal action to provide for the foreigners. But the memories of Egypt and the person of Yahweh were to serve as motivations for them to respond to this, as I've already mentioned. But it is noteworthy that these laws and exhortations to hospitality do not carry an explicit penalty. They're not followed. Instead, the move to practice hospitality, to exhibit that virtue, must arise from within the people. Even Dennis giving us some statistics. Do you hear it? It must arise from within the people, individually and collectively. It was to be a natural outworking of the faith of Israel. But how is this to happen? And this is where the liturgy of Israel plays its part. The various components and the calendarization of the rituals and feasts were designed to shape the identity and ethical character of the people and nurture that hospitality to the vulnerable, which would include the foreigner. The rituals and the feasts were to be performed on a regular basis at prescribed days of the year. In terms of impact, their formative work would have been continuous and part of the rhythms of life itself, each reinforcing God-desired beliefs and behaviors. These rituals and feasts would engage the senses in their participants through the smell of the sacrifices, the taste of the shared meals, with the sound of their voices as they sang, and as they heard those around them singing, and as they lifted their voices in prayer. As mentioned earlier, foreigners were invited to participate in several of these rituals. They were, in essence, invited to the table. These acts of sharing food in Israel's familial settings and holy places would cement in Israelite hearts and in their foreigner hearts the hospitality demanded by Yahweh and through this shared participation, instill in them the fact that the foreigner really was a neighbor. Let me conclude. I think I'm okay on time. This essay has sketched out some aspects of the hospitality ideal that are found in the Old Testament, and I've been kind of jumping over things, so there'd be more in the article. Each part could be explored in much more detail, as well as by expanding it to other themes. Clearly, hospitality is fundamental to the person of our God and should be to our identity, our character, and our mission as the people of God. The hospitality expressed by God's people is a foretaste of the eschaton, when all the nations will gather to worship God. The challenge that remains, and which lies beyond the purview of this essay, is how to implement the hospitality ideal today among the people of God and their ministries, and how to possibly coordinate those efforts with Christian testimony and responsibility in the public square. Especially in a time when globally we are witnessing the migration of tens of millions, both internally displaced peoples and movement across international boundaries. This worldwide complex reality is straining national resources and budgets in multiple spheres and countries on every continent of the world, as well as naturally raising concerns about cultural integration and security at multiple levels and more. I've witnessed these in my travels over the last number of years in Central America, Europe, both Eastern and Western Europe, and Australia. All of them are wrestling with the same issues. Think tanks are being organized, university departments on migration established, journals are being launched, multiple ministries generated to meet all kinds of migrant needs, and the list goes on and on. There is much to process and debate and implement from a Christian perspective. At the very least, the theme of Old Testament hospitality provides a theological framework and impetus and some sort of moral compass as we enter these turbulent waters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carroll, for this stimulating Old Testament presentation.
Do you have a PowerPoint or not? So how do I don't
You're
know how to
good.
do these things. So
I'll take care of it. You can come take a seat for a moment, and yeah, Dr. Magallanges-Tsang will respond.
Significantly shorter person.
It's like magic.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Carroll, for your presentation and for your stimulating research. So Dr. Danny Carroll Rodas has just presented a paper that challenges us to reorient our approach to Old Testament theology at a presuppositional level. His contribution is the essential and foundational work from which we can build our symposium discussions for the rest of this weekend. It is an honor to engage with this esteemed scholar and to pose some questions for further consideration and exploration. I will respond to his paper in 4 parts. And number 1, on approaching hospitality in Old Testament theology. Number 2, on orienting narrative texts. 3, on legislating hospitality. And lastly, 4, on nurturing hospitality. So number 1, on approaching hospitality in Old Testament theology. In conversation with the work of Brittany Melton, Dr. Carroll has challenged us to rethink of a biblical theology of hospitality as an integral theological grid in which we can better understand the nuances of other theological concepts and principles in the Old Testament Hebrew Scripture. Hospitality not only weaves in the mandates of God to his people to care for the marginalized in society, but it also provides us with a new context in which we can glean insights that become apparent when they are in conversation with already established approaches to the Old Testament theology. For instance, the principles of covenant making, kingdom of God, and even creation theology where Lady Wisdom invites everyone to a banqueting table in her 7-pillared house in Proverbs 8 and 9, may very well find their nuance-enhancing home within the context of hospitality. As Christians, a theology of hospitality extends into the New Testament theology, as Jesus quite frequently taught around the table, and he even uses the extended metaphor in parables concerning the kingdom of God. A big, great banquet where people are invited and they refuse to come. Furthermore, when we approach the theologies embedded within the Hebrew canon from a framework of hospitality, it's easier, as Professor Carroll has pointed out, to derive ethical principles and even ethical imperatives from the biblical texts. Number 2, on orienting narrative texts. In his section on exemplary characters, I greatly appreciate Professor Carroll's inclusion of Naomi's own forced migration narrative, since many times it's overlooked. Though it is a story about Ruth, the righteous non-Israelite who is an exemplar, who underscores the shaken faith of an Israelite, it also is about an Israelite's faith being recovered and restored from her own forced migration. 2 members of the quartet of the vulnerable find a place in society, not because of the hesed of Boaz, but because of the hesed embedded in the laws of a hospitable God. Because of God's hesed, a foreigner helps a widow to be redeemed. Thus, Ruth herself, enacting the hesed in God's law, embodies it. Also, when we consider Ruth's story of hospitality and the inclusion of the Gerim, there is a need to underscore the mutual benefit of Naomi and Ruth's arrangement, not only in Bethlehem but also in Moab, because the loyalty of Naomi's daughter-in-laws in many ways reflect their own hospitality and the social and cultural values of Moab. This is important because it demonstrates that hospitality is a universal value that exists among God-fearers outside of the community of Israel. Within the Ketuvim, the writings, the emergence of this type of so-called natural theology or creation-centered theology would have set the stage for retelling of the stories of righteous Gentiles like Job, as well as Ruth. When outlining the hospitality that Ruth experienced within the biblical narrative, Dr. Carroll rightly asserts that true hospitality is not exhibited among God's people only when it is exhibited individually, but also corporately. He says this when he highlights that there is hospitality that is immediate and natural, that of Boaz, and there is some that is learned and acquired by the townspeople during the duration of the Ruth narrative. In underscoring these 2 types of hospitality, one wonders how these intersect. Can they be separated from each other? Can there be a true hospitality if it's only individual, or if it's only a corporate gesture? I believe the answers to these questions become clearer in Dr. Carroll's treatment of Yahweh's legislated hospitality, and even in the Gerim inclusion into the cultic life of Israelite ritual meals and sacrifices. We'll return to this after I comment and ask questions about the Gerim.
Could you try again?
I will try again. Okay. Okay, now, in the inclusion of the Gerim narratives, especially within the narratives of the Deuteronomistic history, should we not also pay attention to the prophetic trajectory of the former prophets? In other words, we need to see what the former prophets are doing with the positive depictions and the negative depictions of the Gentile. In the positive depictions, the non-Israelite outsiders give gifts to the people of God, especially when they are portrayed as acting more faithful to Yahweh than the Israelite leaders are in many instances. For example, Rahab herself shows the spies how to be hospitable to strangers, and she is a foil. And some scholars would say that either she's a foil to Achan or Achan is a foil for her, as being a true Israelite leader or exemplar for what it is to be a Yahweh follower. Uriah the Hittite demonstrates to the readers that a refusal to be comfortable as an act of solidarity is a proper response to an unhoused Ark of the Covenant and displaced soldiers. Ittai the Gittite shows David how to be in exile when he is on the run from his son Absalom. And even Naaman shows Elisha's servant Gehazi how to obey the word of the Lord through his prophets. I agree that the narratives about the non-Israelite sojourners raise issues about discernment and necessary commitments to God, ethnic attitudes, personal sin, and political intrigue, but also that specifically the positive portrayals of the Gerim function prophetically for the people of God by underscoring their infidelity to him. Number 3, legislating hospitality. Dr. Carroll's treatment of God's law concerning hospitality and their real-world implications in their original ancient contexts lend themselves to the next step of developing a biblical ethic of hospitality. It even leads to further practical exploration and implementation of this ethic. So thank you very much for that. In pointing out that in an agrarian economy, one thing that a foreigner most likely did not have was land, Carroll offers a more multi-dimensional and robust view of law and ritual. Many times when we approach the biblical text, we just look at the laws and we forget the cultural context. And some of the nuances are the differences between life and death. My one question in this section would be concerning how the practice of both cultic and mundane rituals, such as foot washing, could possibly have signaled that the stranger status had been changed from nokri to a ger. Would such a public practice have served in the change of the honor and status of the nokri? So is it only about the honor of the host, or is it also about changing the status of the stranger? If so, what would the status of a ger be? Would it be as a part of a host's extended family, as some would suggest? In other words, would the stranger who is incorporated into the life of Israel have been grafted into that host family? In this way, even if they did not own land, would they have the possibility of cultivating and inheriting the land of an heirless landowner? I ask this with Abraham's servant in mind in Genesis 15:3. Number 4, on nurturing hospitality. In speaking of Yahweh's laws and rituals concerning fair treatment of the ger, Dr. Carroll underscores the impact and their continuous formative work as a part of the rhythms of life, each reinforcing God's desired beliefs and behaviors. In highlighting the potential formational role of the law, Professor Carroll echoes what the author of 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 says, when it says that all scripture is inspired by God, or God-breathed, and is useful for teaching, for reproof, correction, and for training in righteousness. This observation is of the utmost importance in incorporating the principle of hospitality in Christian practice. If even these laws are important in spiritual formation, then perhaps we should embrace them with new eyes. Thank you very much.
I'll just thank you, Dr. Magallanes-Tsang, for your response. And as Dr. Carroll goes up I invited him to even reflect on the response, and we now have some time also for questions in the room. And I'll help with there in a second as well, and Max will also help with online comments and questions.
Okay, I don't know how to raise the podium. Okay, all right. Oh, okay, all right, so we're back to normal, right? Thanks so much. Some really good observations. Let me just make some comments, and then we'll just open the floor and we'll just take questions. There's a lot in the paper that you didn't hear, so some of that would respond a bit to what she's saying, but let me just mention some things I think are very good. I really appreciated focusing on Naomi. Because I go to a Latino church, and eso es mi gente, ¿verdad? I was thinking more of the foreigner, but well taken. And so that actually enriches my understanding of the book. So thanks a lot. Naomi is having her own immigrant experience. And the bitterness that she faces and how she regains her faith in God is the very thing. And so the fact that the foreigner actually facilitates that, I think, is a very important thing. So thank you for that. The other thing I thought that was fascinating that you brought up, which is so true, and I tell my students this, is we don't know how to read the Old Testament, right? So, because, you know, we're all kind of engineers or something. We can parse verbs, we don't know how to read a book, right? So, and if you're a prof of biblical literature, you know what I'm talking about. You know, they can't read a text. They can't synthesize. But they can parse the verb. I mean, that kind of thing. What we would call the historical books are the former prophets. And that tells you that these books are to be read prophetically. So I think that's a very good observation. And so, but what we have to learn is how narrative functions in moral formation. Okay? And so that's a whole literary discussion. And those of you who are into literature, you'll understand that conversation of learning how to read and how the genre of narrative actually is formative, and the narrative is prophetic, even if it's not a prophetic book. Okay? And the Jews recognize this and call them the former prophets. So, point well taken. The other thing about the feasts, I come from Roman Catholic tradition, and now I go to an Anglican church in the morning and a Latino church, which is more lively in the afternoons. But I've just been struck by the formative nature of liturgy. So liturgy is not just about me, it's actually trying to do something with and in and to me, not just entertain me. But one thing that I would just mention, the Old Testament text invites the ger into the feast, not the nokri. They recognize the difference. The nokri is not really interested. It's a kind of a vague term. It's a bit of a negative term, but it's very explicit that certain things are available to the ger, but they're not available to the nokri. So the question about how does a nokri become a ger is a question that the Old Testament doesn't really answer. It just leaves you with both categories. There's actually a couple other categories that they use for foreigner, which also tells you, which is interesting, that they will differentiate between different kinds of foreigners. They're not naive, and I think that's important. And I've been doing this now for over 15 years, and this is why I put that section in about there's negative foreigners in Israel too. So let's get past the idealism. We need to get on the ground, and it's complicated. And the Old Testament, in its realism, recognizes that. The question about the land and foreigner, that's another question in the Old Testament. You go to the Jubilee Law, and it mentions that there are non-Israelites that have land. So how did that happen? We don't know. So there's a lot of questions that we just don't have an answer for. But point well taken again. And the last thing, I'm an Old Testament prophet. The Old Testament is just amazing. When people say, oh, the Old Testament is boring, I'm like, how in the world can you say that? I mean, the Old Testament is awesome. I even have my New Testament colleague here who'll be speaking a bit later, Jordan Ryan. So he appreciates the Old Testament. But what you see is that you need the New Testament. As we talk about biblical foundations for hospitality, I think the Old Testament sets us up in so many categories and gives us a realism that expands beyond the New Testament just because it's bigger and it has more to say and talk about. It was a nation state, so they're processing things in a way different than the communities of the New Testament. But we need a New Testament to complete what the Old Testament is saying. So I am canonical, even though I teach the Old Testament. So anyway, we are now open for discussion, correct? So
Yes, we are. And actually, Dean Hanna is happy to move the physical mic around. If you want to raise your hand and ask a question, and Dr. Max will let us know if there's anything coming up online.
Alexia, I was watching your body language and I could tell. Alexia is a dear friend. Hermana, your question?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I kept thinking about Daniel Grudy because I'm actually reading his more recent book right now in Migration Theology.
Yeah.
And as a Catholic, he's it's a constant drumbeat how the liturgy can form us. And particularly the Eucharist, how that forms us around these questions.
Yeah.
But I'm really curious, Danny, that we share the same sort of general category of evangelical, roughly defined, is how do we, is there anything that the two of you sort of would share on how do we see this formative power of the liturgy in contexts that are not sacramental or Catholic?
I'll give my experience. There's two different kinds of discussions. Okay, this is complicated. I've been going to Latino churches now for like 15 years. Okay, and it's not that the liturgy is formative ways we think. It's cathartic. Sing, hug, the hermanos and the hermanas. It's a way to be in a safe space, and we all share food and coffee, and we don't even sometimes we don't want to talk about it because it's what we live every day. So sometimes you don't even hear it mentioned from the pulpit as a topic. What you'll hear is, I've heard this from the pulpit, don't drive too fast so you don't draw attention to yourself. The church I go to, it's the Spanish congregation of a large Bible church, and there's maybe 800, 900 Latinos. It's a mega church in Latino size. But after the recent election, the pastor of the whole church, who's a Colombian, by the way, invited all the elders of the church to come forward. Most of them were Anglos. And he said, we are with you, and we support you. And he had the elders extend their hands over the congregation to pray. It's a different kind of process. They have a police car parked in front, as so many churches do now. And so when that happened, the pastor had gotten up and he said, look, we're going to have a police car here. Don't you worry. I'm not going to ask for your papers. They're here for another reason. You want to talk to them, it's okay. You can even look inside their car, it's not the formative thing going on with the Latinos. So when you ask about the Anglo side, that's a whole different kind of conversation. So, I know Dan Grudy, and I did a blurb for that book, actually. But he's processing it in a very Catholic kind of way, which I think we really need, especially those of us. When I came to faith, it was within more of a free church kind of environment. But this is where the Old Testament has a lot to teach us about how literature should work. Evangelicalism, what happens, it degenerates into entertainment, not formation. The key question is, did you like it? Is the wrong question to ask. The question to ask is God pleased? Anyway, that's a whole other discussion. So that's my initial thoughts.
So much. From my perspective, I grew up in a Latino Pentecostal church, and like we have our own liturgies, even though we say that's not. We have like program spontaneity over the course of time. I mean, we just know it's predictable spontaneity. But what ends up happening, at least like so my mother's Chicana, my dad's from Mexico, but we always like went to the Latino church, predominantly Spanish speaking, that had an English department, and our liturgy was gathering around the word. So part of the whole thing of the project that I'm doing right now on scriptural accompaniment, it's because I saw the parallels of the Catholic theology of accompaniment from the Latino context, and I saw that, we're doing the same things, but we're doing it around the word rather than the Eucharist. But that doesn't mean that there's no meal, because if you ever go to a Latino Pentecostal church, you have to stay there for like 4 hours, because you're going to eat together right afterwards and continue to talk about what you've just heard and experienced in the service. So for me, I feel like the sacrament of the word connected to a meal, that very much is in keeping, at least within my tradition, even though they wouldn't say it's a tradition.
Yeah, one last thing. In Latin America, and in this country, if you're an evangelical or Protestant, you are not Catholic. That is the defining line. You have actually left something. That was my experience. You consciously leave. So to somehow replicate, that's why the Anglican Church doesn't grow that much in Latin America, but it's too close. So you have to understand that cultural dynamic. So it's going to have to be processed very differently than the Anglo kind of idea. It just, the Catholics will do it. Try to put that in the conversation with a Latino Protestant pastor, and you're in a different conversation. That's just the cultural reality. Yes.
Thank you so much for your paper and the response. I was really curious about Sophia's observations about the prophetic nature of the Gerim in our presence. Mm-hmm. And in two sides, both in the positive driving side for change, and also perhaps the negative burden side on the Gerim to be prophetic for the folks who are here. So I just wondered if y'all could expand on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciated Sophia mentioning that. I've actually talked to Latino pastors, and Alexia, you do a lot of work with Latino pastors, so you could chime in on that. But some of them will say that they feel called to evangelize this country. And I get it. And the thing is, the New Testament tells us that we're all strangers. But we don't really understand that. So you hear all this metaphorical language about, we're in Babylon and all this. Well, okay, but you're actually pretty acculturated into your strange world. So I think one of the ways that the foreigner knows what it means to be strange. Language, culture, accent, whatever, food. So I think they can remind us. That's part of the role of the foreigners, to remind us just how strange this place really is. How ungodly this place really is. And as you know, there's 10, I'm going to speak on the Latino side. I can't speak to other groups. My colleague can speak to the Filipino side. But there's tens of thousands of Latino churches around the country. Good work. So I think there's a prophetic voice, a prophetic presence. We can talk about the secular side of all the work they do to keep this place running. But I would say that the thing that I see, and I'm the old guy talking here, okay? Danger, and Sophia, it'd be interesting to get your point on this. The prophetic voice can be co-opted. Co-opted by non-Latinos who want to be the saviors. So you bring them into your college or seminary, and they're just one of several options. So they kind of get domesticated. I mean, they're present, but they're basically just one of the smorgasbord of options you can take. So you see them being co-opted. Then what I see, and this is something I've seen a lot, is that you'll have people, young people coming out of evangelical backgrounds and want to do further study. They don't have money. So they'll go to certain mainline institutions because they have money. They will fund you. And watch what happens to their faith. And I've seen it where they either lose their faith or it gets morphed in a way that they have no way of really communicating with the church that they grew up in. They've been co-opted into a world of theology that speaks, we're doing Latino readings. No, you're not, actually. You're doing elitist readings that no Latino church would even understand what you're talking about. And I'm seeing some Latinos here and Latinas, they understand what I'm talking about. That's the unspoken conversation at SBL. Co-optation of the minorities. Not only as an idea, but the minorities themselves get co-opted, and they don't even see it. They lose their roots. So that's where the whole prophetic thing gets more and more complicated. And that's why I go to a Latino church. If I don't, I'm a hypocrite. And Alexia, I know, would agree with me. I know there's a lot of good people there. I know Alexia, so. Yeah. Una hermana muy querida, auténtica.
So, thank you so much for that. It's so right that we need to make sure that we don't get stuck somewhere that is actually like co-opting our voice instead of actually using it as a place to articulate the voices of our communities. So, like, to answer your question about the prophetic, some of the work that I'm doing in the book of Job, it talks about the quartet of the vulnerable as already being positionally prophetic. So when we look at the major prophets, we see the injustice and the oppression of the poor kind of is an unspoken barometer for their idolatry and their infidelity to Yahweh. In many cases, it's injustice against these vulnerable groups is paired with idolatry. And I'm sorry for being overly simplistic here, the scholar in the prophetic literature. But I do believe, like a lot of times people would say that I'm a liberation theologian, and I would say, no, there's something else. And so finally, in the book of Job, I've been articulating that from a Pentecostal holiness perspective, it's not just that the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger are given preferential treatment, it's that they are holy. They're holy because they are experiencing the violation of God's laws. So they experience the otherness of God in people violating God's boundaries. These vulnerable, they are experiencing the same. They are prophetic in their position of like embodying how God's laws have been violated.
There's the Pentecostal preacher right there. But let me kind of piggyback real fast. This to me opens up a whole another discussion of Old Testament theology, which is idolatry. Because I think idolatry is not only about other gods, it's about a false Yahweh. And we see that, and the prophets are fighting this all the time. It's not that people don't believe in Yahweh. The question is, what kind of Yahweh do you believe in? Okay? And even in the narratives, that's what you're seeing, that they're fighting against Yahweh believers. Mm-hmm. because they have a false view of Yahweh. And so I think that's a whole nother discussion that can be brought in. Theme.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. I think we have a question in the back. And throughout the day, if you're asking a question, it's great to introduce yourself quickly as well.
Okay. Thanks, Nathan. Gabriel J. Katanis. I'm a covenant pastor, also affiliate faculty at Fuller with Alexia. Thank you so much, both of you, for your presentations. I appreciate very much the comments guarding against idealism and also advocating for some realism. How do we remain hospitable and realistic in ways that also will not become co-opted, especially in our engagement with the secular state?
Any other questions? But this is one of the reasons why. Well, two things. I put that in the paper on purpose. We need to get past the idealism, but we can't lose it. That's why I said, even with all the things that we see in the Old Testament, the ideal holds. The laws hold. And I think that's important. We engage all the realism, which is very ugly, coming from every direction, even within the immigrant community, if we're honest. The ideal holds. I think that's what we need to cling to. So that would be the first thing. And at a conference like this, everyone wants to stay at the ideal level, to be honest. I get it. But those of us who are with Latinos, it's on the ground, buddy. So what do we do? So I would say that we cannot lose the idealism. The hospitality ideal holds in narratives, in the laws, and in the prophetic eschaton. So we need to hold that. Now, how we engage the secular state, it depends on your church denomination. A Reformed person will process this different than a Roman Catholic, than a Mennonite, and a Lutheran. They have actually different theological frameworks of even how to understand the state. That's a whole other discussion. I co-edited a book with Leopoldo Sanchez. I don't know if you know Leopoldo. He's at Concordia in St. Louis. He's a Lutheran, Missouri Synod. But what we did was, it's called, in fact, Michael Thompson. He's with Whips and Stock. And they published the book. Okay. You want a commercial here? Or Okay. But we published a book called Immigrant Neighbors Among Us. But it's a collection of how different theological traditions engage the state and understand immigration. And we have a Lutheran, we have a Catholic, we have a Free Church. I'm the Bible guy. We've got a Reformed, we've got a Pentecostal. And each of them are processing the whole topic just differently because they're doing it from within their tradition. So that's where I would begin. I think it also depends on local politics. Doing this in Chicago versus Phoenix is very different. Brittany, you were going to say something. I saw you raise your hand.
I was just going to jump on that and ask about applying the realism of the Old Testament in its depiction of God's people to the American church as well. So it's realism about the complexities of immigration and foreigners, but then also the complexities of God's people everywhere, including in the U.S., and how that might contribute to how we approach this issue.
Yeah, I mean, if we're the people of God and the text is our text, then they are mirrors of ourselves. So yeah, that's why I think the theme of idolatry is a very important one. But yeah, and I think those laws can serve us as a moral compass to engage the public square. Why would we want to institute an agrarian law from 3,000 years ago? That doesn't make any sense. But there can be a moral compass for how we might engage and formulate laws today. And I could give you several examples of how I think it can, but that might be over coffee, just unless I can do it now. I mean, it's up to you guys. But anyway, that's how it began.
So, thank you so much. Yes, the texts are a mirror. The law of the Lord is a mirror, like it says in James. And when we enact God's laws, we have an opportunity to see that we ourselves are in need of mercy. So it's not only that God's laws are the standard and are a mirror in that way, but it's also that when we do, work on behalf of others that cannot help themselves, we remind ourselves that this is what we look like. This is who we are before God. We are in dire need of His hospitality, His grace, and His mercy. Now, going back to the idealistic, like that, for me, that ideal, if we grab a hold of, we need to start with acknowledging our need to be reminded of who we are and who we are to be to each other. And I hope this doesn't sound like a cop-out. This is why we have the symposium and why we have specialists in biblical studies and why we're here to listen to other people so we can give feet to this ethic.
And I would add one thing as a pastor. It's been my experience. I'm not a pastor, but I've spoken a lot on immigration. And when I speak to normally Anglo audiences, and I just show the amount of material, it's just massive. Normally I give you, can you do this in like 45 minutes? How about half an hour? Would that be enough? So I was in Indianapolis just about a month ago, and they gave me 6 hours, and we didn't get through it all there. I mean, it's just massive. Anyway, but when I do this with Anglo audiences, the response I get is, wow, we didn't know that was in there. That's just amazing.
Okay.
And then when I do it with Latino audiences, wow, no sabíamos que eso estaba en la Biblia. No, it either, because from their pulpits, they hear doctrine. Okay? So they've never heard these things either. Esas son nuestras historias. Those are our stories. Ahí estamos nosotros. We're there. And part of our task as biblical people is to show that it's not just for the Anglo receivers. These stories are written by the people who actually lived it. They really have first call. And that's kind of going to what you have been saying. And I think that's a whole other discussion that normally in conferences, it's always about those up here. The text really is about these people down here. And to begin to work with Latino churches, and Alexia, I know I keep mentioning you, but to be able to have them see, maybe for the very first time, that they are walking the pages of the Old Testament. It's amazing. When I've done this, I have them crying. Because for the first time, me, familia. Because they've lived the story, not just doctrine. That's the challenge, is to be able to speak to both audiences, because they both are needful with a different.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think we have time for one more and maybe one online, and then we'll.
Well, it's not really, just very quickly. So another shameless plug. There were people asking about the book with Whippenstock that's coming forth. Could you please repeat the title?
Okay, this actually was published several years ago.
Oh, several years ago. Okay, sorry.
It's called Immigrant Neighbors Among Us.
Immigrant Neighbors Among Us. So those who are online who asked, Immigrant Neighbors Among Us from Whippenstock.
And then the book where I do, this is the shameless plug. I have a book, The Bible in Borders, which is back there. Okay. And then Reading the Bible Latinamente. So it's co-authored with Ruth Padilla de Borst and Miguel Echeverria. The idea is, what would it be like to try to read texts? Even though we all realize that our churches are kind of doctrinally focused, what would it be to read Latinamente from the Latino church? And that's what you'll find back there as well. Reading the Bible Latinamente and the Bible in Borders.
Thank you to both of you, and especially for that final reflection just on seeing ourselves in Scripture. That's something for us to carry through the rest of the day. Thank you for this session to both of you. We're going to take a break now, and we're going to shift, let's see, on the official schedule. Let's come back at 10:25.